hope you are doing well. So last time when we were reviewing, we created this diagram where we were analyzing the important mapping and structures of within Spoke. So I haven't looked in till now. So the only thing that I have looked so far is the add reserves. The most difficult thing for me is keeping track of all the data structures. So I did create like this diagrams for and like keeping in mind about the interest like the structures. So let's start with the add reserve, and I'll try my best to actually remember what each data structure meant, and we can take it from there. I think we don't need to create like the diagrams for each every function. We'll just refer to this diagram that we have created, right? So first of all, add reserve, what does it do? So add reserve is basically we are adding liquidity to the, like we are adding a reserve of pool, right? And we are adding that reserve to the hub that is here. So hub so what does uh, reserve means? Reserve is basically the liquidity of a token that we are adding to a hub, right? And hub is a pool, you can say, of some tokens, right? And asset ID is basically the asset that we are adding within the hub. It should be whitelisted within the hub. Price source is basically the oracle that will tell us the price, and reserve config is basically uh, the config that has details about the collateral risk and the bits of like whether the protocol is sorry the operations are paused. And I think this is under this should be under Spoke itself. If the reserve can be liquidated, okay. So we are when we are creating reserve, right? And what are the collateral risk, which is the risk associated collateral risk, and we are also taking dynamic config, which is basically the collateral factor that how much the user can like how much percentage of the collateral he can borrow. And max liquidation is like the what is the maximum amount of collateral that can be taken up by the liquidator, and the fee, right? So we are taking two things. First is the collateral, like we are set when we are adding reserve, we are making sure that the hub knows, okay, for this reserve the maximum so this is the configuration that the collateral factor is this is the liquidation fee, and this is the liquidation bonus. Apart from that, we are also setting the parameters whether liquidation is allowed or not, and the risk factor, okay. And it is restricted to some certain user roles, and we are doing some checks that the hub should not be 0, asset ID should be less than or equals to the maximum amount of asset ID which should be a type 16 max. And then we are checking whether the reserve already exists. Then we are validating all the configurations. So basically in the validate just a second, validate reserve config, we are checking that the collateral risk that is provided within the config. Wait a second, just give me a second. Yeah, so in the validate reserve config, we are checking the config that the collateral risk, like how much the user is like what is the risk of this collateral, like how risk is this collateral, we are checking under reserve config, and it should be like less than or equal to the maximum collateral risk, and we are doing some checks for dynamic. We are then adding the reserve ID here, so it starts with 0, and then we are making it 1, right? So now the reserve count starts from 1 for for the reserve that we are adding, plus like what was the previous plus 1, and then we are creating the dynamic config key for this reserve. So dynamic key config key are basically the versions of the new settings, right? So you can like the first, so I think this should work something like this. So for the, just a second. I think this should be like uh, something like reserves, reserves, reserve ID, and then we are checking dynamic config, something like this. We must be checking. Yeah, I think this is what we are doing, and then we are calling the hub and getting the underlying token for the, like what, like for this asset ID, what is the underlying token, and we are getting its decimal. So this we will be getting 9 tokens for this asset. Yeah, and then we are checking whether the underlying token is not, like underlying token is not set, and which means that assets is not listed under the hub, means that we are checking, like we are trying to add only the reserves for whitelisted token, and then we are uh, saving the reserves price source, which is like reserve. We are, so we got the, so we got the reserve ID here, we added, then we are like for the reserve ID, which means reserve ID app save this price source, and price source is something that we are providing, and then we are creating the reserve. So we are creating reserve of like what are so we are creating reserves, and then we are putting reserve like reserve, and then we are saving to reserve ID the reserve itself, which includes the underlying token, the hub, the asset ID for this reserve, the decimals, the configuration key, the collateral that the user is saying, another detail, and then we are saving uh, dynamic. Okay, so there is dynamic config for reserve id. Okay, this is not true. And then saving dynamic config, which was 0. No, this is not. Dynamic config is basically this here. Dynamic config. Oh, sorry. We were taking key, right? And then we are actually saving the dynamic configuration for a reserve within the key, and then we are setting the reserve exist of this hub to this is it asset as true, and then we are just emitting results. Yeah, emitting. Okay, so now what are the the key data structures that we are touching upon is we are updating the reserve exist after creating the reserve. Then we are also updating the dynamic configuration for that reserve, and then we are also updating reserves, right? And what are we doing? Yeah, I think these are the only three. Yes, so these are the only things that we are changing. So for with like there is a mapping of reserves that we are updating with the configuration that we have set. So reserve is basically just a second. So reserve has like details about what is the underlying token, what are the hub, asset id, etc, etc. So we are saving the reserve id and the reserve, like what the hub does it represents, etc. And the dynamic configuration for the reserve, where is it? Yeah, here. So for this reserve, what is the dynamic configuration, and sorry, for this reserve and for this dynamic configuration, what is the dynamic reserve config, and dynamic reserve config is like basically the collateral factor, etc. We can adjust it like in future, like whenever we want to update. I think we can do that, right? Because at the end of the day, we must be saving this dynamic config somewhere. So we are actually saving under dynamic config key. Where is that reserve? Here is the dynamic, and we can actually update it anytime. So in the future, whenever I like the privileged user wanted to change the settings, they can like create a new key and they can direct it towards it. Yeah, update. The most confusing thing is like the config is the universal, whether the flags and the collateral risk. Okay, and dynamic config basically is the fee and the collateral factor. Okay. So the I think the best way to remember would be, for the config is basically consists the config which is where is it? Reserve config basically consists of two things, namely collateral risk and the 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 status is basically, right? So reserve config is that, dynamic is basically collateral factor and liquidation related things, dynamic. Okay, we are updating reserve config, which is basically the risk factor and the flags. So we are checking, and then the config. So for just a second, for this reserve id, get all the details, and then we are getting the reserve, which is on this. Then we are checking whether the address is set, then we are returning the reserve. We have reserve, then in the collateral risk, so reserve config na. Okay, so it does have collateral risk, right? So we are updating the collateral. Was it under, wait a second, yeah, it is there, and the flags are there. Okay, wait a second, but I'm confused here. Is that we had like two things config, which are like under the flags? Is it right? Okay, reserve flags, and then okay. Got it. I think I understand now. So we are using the config key in terms of dynamic parameters like liquidation fee and the collateral factor, right? So we are using the version for like dynamic function for that, and we are using the reserve config to actually manipulate the configuration directly without the version controlling, right? So we can update, but we cannot create a new version of it. So we are checking the configuration of the reserve, then we are updating the reserve collateral risk is the updated, what is they saying, and reserve dot flag is basically the flags that we are creating when we are updating the reserve config. And for updating we were updating it on the hub, so I think this will make a call to hub with the reserve id and the price source. The reserve id is not less than the reserve count. Wait a second, reserve count is the number of reserved in the spoke. So reserve id, okay, we are checking, and we are doing, what we are doing is that set reserve, so reserve id and the prices, yeah, that was I was saying. Okay, we can add another version of config to a reserve, that is correct. Okay, which is what I was referring to, like the same thing. We can, in the reserve struct, basically we can store like a configuration like dynamic configuration parameter, and that reflects to the latest setting, but for the parameters, like the config parameters, reserve config parameters, like for example the flags as well as the collateral risk, we need to update it within the reserve itself. We don't have the ability to create the dynamic versions for that. Yeah. Dynamic config again is the what was it, dynamic, I know it is there, collateral factor, liquidation fee, etc. So we are taking the reserve id, dynamic config, and for this reserve id we first need to, I think it should be under where was it, yeah, dynamic config, reserve id, dynamic key, we change it. Okay, and it is dynamic key equals to reserve id, what is the current dynamic key, and we are checking whether it is not greater than this. And then we are validating the dynamic reserve config. And then we are setting up the dynamic config key, which we fetched from the reserve itself, and then adding 1 to it. But what is this? Then for the reserve ID, we are changing the dynamic key that we updated here to +1, and then we are also within the dynamic config for this reserve, we are changing the dynamic key to the config that the user is providing and emitting. Okay, and this is for adding new dynamic, and we are using here for updating. So it should be simple that we are getting the dynamic key within right from the reserve ID. Should be some dynamic config reserve ID dynamic config key, and we are changing it here. I am not pretty sure about what position manager are. Let's search. Sorry. What are position managers? Because I am seeing position managers a lot of places, right? Position managers are authorized intermediary contract that executes operation on spoke contracts on behalf of users. They act as gateways between users and the protocol, providing additional functionality like gasless transaction and native token handling. Two main implementations in each gateway. Native gateway. User must explicitly approve position managers via the spokes set before they can act on users' behalf. Gasless transaction gateway allows users to send. Okay. So basically we want the position managers to be utilizing, like, they are separated contracts for gasless transactions, etc. So they can, like, we need to approve them, and then they can take action based upon our needs, which will save us a lot of gas. Okay, so let's understand supply, right? So before we go into the code base, right, let's see how like, imagine, like, how would the flow generally would look like, right? So from my my perspective, we should be getting the reserve. We should be getting the reserve from reserve ID, where we will get the hub address, which because at the end of the day we have to supply to that, right? And we need to so there are positions, user positions, user position that we would need to update, and it is called underscore user positions for the reserve id, like, which is here, and we need to update them, like what are the supplied shares, etc. And since okay, it's already done. Reserve id, it's not, no, liquidation config is not something that we need to look in. Reserves, of course we want reserves. Position status, what it is it, bucket, okay, let's see. Yeah, so this is my thing. So for we are storing how does it work? Basically, sorry, so we are fetching the reserve id directly here, and we want to make sure that the hub is not 0, and then we are returning the reserve here. User position is basically user position struct, which is addressed to a mapping of user position, and usually, okay, never mind. Yeah, so this is that, right? We sorry, so we are getting the user position, like how we provide the user address here, and we are providing the reserve id, which will give us the user position for that reserve id. So we are supplying, right? So we want to only put that under the right reserve, and we are checking validate supply that the flags that must not be paused or frozen, and we are doing on flags, right? And then we are transferring the underlying token to the hub add shares to message sender on hub itself. Yeah, so there are so I noticed that hub also have a tracking mechanism where they are tracking the shares within themselves. It's not just the spoke that is keeping track of the user position, but the hub as well. So we are adding the reserve, what is it, how are we doing this? So we are getting the reserve dot hub, we are calling the dot add function, and add assets on behalf of user. Here it is. So we are taking asset id and amount, and we are doing something. Okay, so we are creating two shares, assets shares, spoke shares. So it's not just the user share, we are adding and have add shares to spoke. So we are supplying I'm a little confused here, because when we are doing the transfer beforehand, right, and then we are adding in the next step, right? So the assets are transferred, right? The assets are transferred to hub. Then what does hub do is it's basically calculating the liquidity plus amount. What is the available token right now, and plus the amount. Okay, and it's checking the balance of the token for this amount, and they need to be equal. Okay. Okay, I understand that. Now what's going on is that it's basically checking whether the liquidity, which is like the internal tracking, and the the token tracking within the, like, the token ERC20 itself, are like either equal or greater. It should be not less than, which basically like make sure that the users have added, and let add to the like the shares. It'll add up on the shares equals to shares, and I'll spoke shares, and I'll just do that. So what happens when we are supplying, uh, we just pass the tokens to that, and which basically mints shares. No, first of all we transfer, right, and then we call add, which basically with the amount, uh, right. Just a second here, let's put it here. We just provide it beforehand, and then we are actually checking whether the tracking plus the amount is at least the balance of the hub, and then we are actually minting shares for the spoke, and we are also increasing the assets share. Yeah. So we have supplied shares, right, and what we are returning here is shares. What okay, these are asset shares. Okay, we are returning what shares were minted for the asset, and then we are what is user position? User position is basically bronze shares, premium shares. Bronze shares are the one that the how much debt is on the user. The premium share tracks interest. Supplied shares are like how much user has supplied, and dynamic config if I can recall, is basically liquidation parameters and the collateral factor, right? So that is like under what configuration the user is being add upon. Supplied shares, user position, behalf of, yeah. So a quick question would be like, if you want to save dynamic configuration, right? So key, let's say 0. Okay. But again, then not actually updating the dynamic configuration key, but that's for like the borrowing part, right? It's not the supply part. Yeah. So for withdraw, what we are doing is we are taking three parameters: reserve ID, amount, and on behalf of, which is like uh, that the position managers can act upon the users. So withdraw, right? So we are taking reserve, we are fetching the reserve storage for that reserve ID. We are fetching the user's position based on the asset ID. Hmm. Yeah, so when we want to withdraw, right, from like what we have actually deposited under the supplied shares, should be somewhere here, right? Let me just see. Supplied. Sorry. Yeah. So when we are withdrawing, right, we want we what we are doing is we are taking reserve amount and on behalf, and we are checking whether the position manager is allowed to act upon. Mm. Like we need to approve. uh, position managers, and we are taking reserve ID and user positions, and we are validating with rows. Basically it should not be paused, and if that is there, we call what if okay. Yep. So that's that. Just a second, let me just get back up. Where was, yeah, so we are checking whether the reserve is not yep. Then we are getting the hub address, and we are getting what reserve ID. Okay, yeah, so we are getting the asset ID for that reserve, and we are calculating the withdrawn amount. Withdraw is the minimum of, okay, we are passing amount, of course, amount hub dot preview remove by shares. I think they are the amount of shares, right? So it's, we are getting like hub dot preview remove by shares. Yeah, I said user position or supplied, like how much is the supplied shares, and we are taking the minimum of either of those. See how does it work. We are taking assets, assets. It has all this. The majority of the accounting happens in the hub itself. So what does this do? It's under asset logic, right? So we take asset, which is the, what are we passing here? No. So we are acting upon the asset ID to add it, okay, and we return. Dude, this is complicated. We act upon the shares. What are the shares? I don't understand the syntax here. So we are passing we should be fetching the data from assets itself, right? But we are returning to assets down shares. How does it work? Let's see. Yeah, so it's basically returning it basically returns how much shares you will be returned. No, not sorry, there is assets you will be returned based on the user's position, and we are taking the minimum of those two. And then we are removing the withdrawn amount. Let me just try to understand this whole line because I'm confused about this. So okay, so if user is asking, let's say 100 here, but it shows 50 here based on the user's position, then we are just giving 50, not more than that. So this is done. So we are then removing the shares. Wait, on here. Yeah. So we are taking three things: asset ID, the amount, and the address to where we need to transfer the tokens. Asset ID, the amount, and the address to the message center itself, which will be the position manager. So position what withdrawn shares. Yep. So what we're doing is we are taking the assets, asset ID, spoke, and the spokes data for the message sender, which will be the user, of course. And then we are checking the liquidity, and the amount that is requested should be under the liquidity, and we are calculating the shares by amount to add shares up. So we are minus doing the removal. doc which is here. Let's understand this. I'm just saying here. The assets ID to assets and takes. Okay. Not. I don't get what they're trying to say, but that's fine because we will get into understanding the maths behind the shares calculation sooner in like the upcoming videos. But as of now, we want to understand how does spoke interacts with the main hub itself. So okay, so where were we? We got the count of how much, what is the minimum the user can withdraw, and then we are just calling the remove function within the hub, which basically rounds down the added share for assets and the spokes, and also removes the liquidity, and just transfer the underlying to the user based on the amount, right? And the amount is and the check for like the spoke happens here, and the amount is here. So we are called the minimum the user can withdraw in terms of shares, and then we are removing the position of shares for the user within and then we are removing the user position. The hell is this? takes position status and reserve ID, do some bitwise, but returns if a user is using the specified reserve as collateral. Like if it's using risk premium, no risk premium is oh, this is way complicated now. Yeah, DeFi is of course very complicated. It's very like it's expected. Yeah, so it basically updates risk premiums only if the user is using the supplied shares as collateral for a borrow position. And then we have borrow. And we just increase the share for borrows. And how does borrow works? Something I want to know. Function draw. It just checks the liquidity, and the amount should be less than or equals to the liquidity provided. Okay. Also we are fetching the spoke data, so we are draw asset and we are increasing the we are basically increasing the drawn shares for the assets as well as to the spoke, and then your mind decreasing the liquidity. Yes, transferring. So the main thing that we want to know is basically where is the actual logic of calculating how much the user can owe, right? Position status. Let's see what the hell is position status. The max. And we are calculating amount. Yeah, interesting. I don't see a mapping of how much Wait a second, this I'm confused. So user positions had branches and all. Session status has this. I did not. What the hell is? Did I miss it? Position status. This is missed somehow. Yeah, so this is very complicated. Hmm. Yeah, I think I will be dropping out of the idea of reviewing Aave V4 at this stage because, of course, I'm going to come back to Aave soon. But the problem with Aave is that it is looking very complicated, and I don't want to be like giving up. I really don't like giving up. But the thing is, this is super complicated, and at this point in time where I'm just starting out, reviewing everything right, it does not make sense for me to go such in depth, and I get overwhelmed. But yes, it is really good experience of understanding. So I really do want to not give up, but I don't see an option. Yeah, let's see. Let's see in the future videos how it goes. And that's it for today. See ya.